Antony and Cleopatra, a love that shook an empire. Chapter 1: The General and the Queen. The sun hung low over Tarsus, casting golden light upon the river Cydnus. The city, caught between east and west, held its breath as a spectacle unlike any other approached. Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful men, stood at the water's edge, waiting. He had summoned Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, to answer for her alleged support of his enemies. Yet, instead of a fearful petitioner, she arrived like a goddess descending from Olympus. Her barge, with sails of purple silk, glided across the river. The scent of burning incense filled the air. Musicians played soft, hypnotic melodies. And there she was, Cleopatra, reclining beneath a golden canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, her dark eyes filled with mischief and power. Antony was a man of war, a soldier who had fought beside Julius Caesar and now ruled Rome's eastern provinces. But as he watched Cleopatra approach, he felt something shift inside him. He was used to commanding legions, yet here was a woman who commanded a presence greater than any army. Cleopatra stepped onto the shore, her movements deliberate, her lips curved in the barest of smiles. "Lord Antony," she greeted, her voice rich and smooth, "I come not as a subject, but as a queen." Antony laughed, charmed by her audacity. "Then I shall treat you as one," he said, extending his hand. She did not take it immediately, letting the moment stretch just long enough to remind him that she was no ordinary woman. That night, Cleopatra did not plead her case before Antony as others had. Instead, she invited him to a feast aboard her ship. He accepted, intrigued, as he stepped onto her barge. He found himself entering another world, a world of Egyptian splendor, of golden goblets and exotic wines, of rare perfumes and intoxicating beauty. As they dined, Cleopatra spoke not just of Egypt, but of Rome, of power, of destiny. Antony had known many women, but none like her. By the time the night ended, he was no longer her judge. He was her admirer, and soon he would be her lover. Chapter 2: The Seduction of a Roman. The affair began in Tarsus, but it did not end there. Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, where she welcomed him into her kingdom as if he were already a king. He had spent years in Rome, where power was cold and calculated, but in Egypt, power was pleasure, indulgence, and spectacle. Cleopatra showed him the wonders of her land, the great pyramids, the vast libraries, the temples where gods and mortals intertwined. She flattered him, entertained him, matched him drink for drink in lavish feasts. In Rome, men whispered that she had bewitched him, but Antony did not care. He had found something in Cleopatra that he had never found in Rome: joy. For a year, he stayed in Alexandria, reveling in luxury and love. They formed their own secret society, the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to feasting, drinking, and outdoing one another in mischief. One night, Antony tried to impress Cleopatra by catching fish from the Nile. She, knowing his competitive spirit, had a servant secretly attach a salted fish to his hook. When Antony pulled up his prize, Cleopatra laughed, and he laughed with her. Yet beneath the games, something deeper grew. Cleopatra was not just a lover. She was a queen with ambitions, and Antony, though lost in pleasure, was still a man of Rome. As the months passed, their love became something more than passion. It became a partnership. But Rome did not forget its general, and soon, duty would call him back. Chapter 3: A Kingdom or an Empire. In the autumn of 40 BCE, Antony stood on the balcony of Cleopatra's palace, looking over Alexandria's harbor. A warm breeze carried the scent of the sea, and behind him, Cleopatra lounged on a couch, absently running her fingers through a bowl of pomegranate seeds. "You will have to leave soon," she said, her voice calm. but he could hear the weight behind her words. Antony sighed. In Alexandria, he was a king in all but name, but in Rome, he was a general, a consul, a man bound by duty, and duty had come calling. Messengers had arrived from Italy bearing urgent news. Fulvia, his wife, had raised an army against Octavian, his rival and co-ruler of Rome. The conflict had ended in disaster. Fulvia was dead, and Octavian was strengthening his grip on power. If Antony did not return, his place in Rome could be lost forever. Cleopatra watched him, waiting. She would not beg him to stay. She did not beg for anything. "You are a queen," Antony finally said. "You understand power. I must go, but I will return." She tilted her head, her dark eyes unreadable. "Do you swear it?" He stepped toward her, cupping her face in his hands. "By all the gods of Rome and Egypt, I swear it." And so, Antony left Alexandria, sailing toward a Rome that was no longer his home. Chapter 4: A Marriage of Convenience. When Antony arrived in Rome, he found it on the verge of civil war. His absence had weakened his position, and Octavian, young, calculating, and ruthless, was consolidating power to restore order. Octavian proposed a solution. Antony should marry his sister, Octavia. It was a political move, a marriage to secure peace between two rivals. Octavia was beautiful, noble, and virtuous, everything Rome valued in a woman, but she was not Cleopatra. Antony knew what was expected of him. He married Octavia, played the role of the dutiful husband, and for a time, it seemed as if Rome's balance had been restored, but his heart remained in Egypt. Letters came from Alexandria, filled with Cleopatra's wit and longing. "Shall I send an army to steal you back?" she once wrote, half in jest. "Or will you come willingly?" For 3 years, Antony remained in the West, governing Rome's territories and raising children with Octavia. Yet Rome was not the same without him. The Senate was filled with whispers of Octavian's growing power, of how he slowly turned Antony into a figurehead rather than an equal. In 37 BCE, Antony could no longer ignore his true allegiance. Under the pretense of war against Parthia, he sailed east back to Cleopatra. Chapter 5: The Gifts of a Queen. When Antony returned to Alexandria, Cleopatra did not greet him as a lover scorned, nor did she make him grovel for her forgiveness. Instead, she welcomed him as a ruler welcomes a returning king. She had been waiting for this moment. That winter, they sealed their alliance not just in love, but in power. Cleopatra gifted Antony an army and gold for his Parthian campaign. In return, Antony granted her lands, Cyprus, Crete, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. He declared their children as rulers: Alexander Helios as king of Armenia and Parthia, Ptolemy Philadelphus as king of Syria, and Cleopatra Selene as queen of Cyrene. The Roman Senate was outraged. Antony had not only abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, he had publicly declared Cleopatra his queen and their children as heirs to eastern lands. It was a direct challenge to Octavian. Octavian wasted no time. He began spreading propaganda, painting Antony as a traitor who had fallen under the spell of an Egyptian temptress. He showed Antony's will to the Senate, proving that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. To Rome, Antony was no longer just an enemy. He was a threat. Chapter 6: War on the Horizon. By 32 BCE, the alliance between Antony and Cleopatra was no longer just a personal affair. It was a political crisis. Rome officially declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. Octavian framed the conflict as a war against a foreign queen, corrupting a Roman leader. He knew Rome would never fight for Antony alone, but against Cleopatra, against Egypt, against the decadent East. That was a war Rome would embrace. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces. In the summer of 31 BCE, their fleets met Octavian's navy at Actium. Cleopatra, ever a queen, led her own fleet. They had numbers, but Octavian had strategy. The battle was a disaster. As Octavian's forces closed in, Cleopatra ordered her ships to retreat, and Antony, caught between battle and love, followed her. His men saw it as abandonment. His allies deserted him. Actium was lost, and with it, Antony's hope of ruling Rome. Chapter 7: The Fall of a General. Antony stood on the deck of Cleopatra's flagship, staring at the horizon where the Battle of Actium had raged. His navy was shattered, his legions scattered. The once great general of Rome was now a fugitive, retreating to Alexandria with the only army he had left: Cleopatra's love and loyalty. As their ships docked in the great harbor of Alexandria, the city welcomed them with forced cheer. The streets were still lined with banners, and musicians played as if celebrating a victory. But beneath the golden facade, fear had taken hold. Cleopatra had seen power rise and fall before. She had survived the death of Julius Caesar, the betrayal of her brother, and the endless threats to her throne, but this was different. She watched Antony closely. He drank more, he laughed less. One evening, as they sat in the palace gardens, Antony looked at her and said, "Do you regret following me from Actium?" Cleopatra tilted her head, searching his face. "Would you have stayed if I had not?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No." "Then no," she said, "I regret nothing." But even as she spoke the words, she knew their time was slipping away. Chapter 8: The Lion and the Jackal. In Rome, Octavian wasted no time. He sent envoys to Antony's remaining generals, offering them wealth and titles if they abandoned their fallen leader. One by one, they defected. Antony's legions in the east surrendered without a fight. The mighty Roman general was now a commander without an army. Yet Cleopatra did not despair. She had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades through cunning and resolve. If Rome came for her, she would make them bleed for every step they took. She met with her advisors, preparing Alexandria's defenses. She sent envoys to distant allies, seeking aid. She considered fleeing to India, where they might build a new kingdom far from Rome's reach. But Antony no longer had the will for such dreams. He spent his nights drinking, reliving past victories, as if drowning the present in memories of the past. Cleopatra watched him, torn between love and survival. If he could no longer fight for himself, could he still fight for her? Chapter 9: Betrayal Within the Walls. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions reached Egypt. The once great empire of the pharaohs braced for its final war. Antony rallied the last of his loyal forces and met Octavian's army outside Alexandria. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old general had returned. His men fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. But then, betrayal struck. His cavalry, bribed by Octavian, defected mid-battle. Antony watched in horror as his own men turned their spears against him. Defeated, he fled back to the palace, knowing that Alexandria was lost. Cleopatra had prepared for this. She locked herself in her mausoleum, spreading rumors that she had taken her own life. She hoped that, in grief, Antony might escape and save himself. But the news had the opposite effect. Chapter 10: Antony's Final Hour. When Antony heard that Cleopatra was dead, something inside him shattered. The woman he had fought for, the queen he had defied Rome for, was gone, there was nothing left. Standing in his chamber, Antony felt the weight of his choices. He had fought Rome and lost. He had defied an empire for love, and now love, too, seemed lost. His closest servant, Eros, stood by his side, sorrow in his eyes. Antony turned to him. "It seems my time has come." Eros, unwilling to witness his master's downfall, turned away, overwhelmed. Antony steadied himself. He had faced battlefields, storms, and betrayals. He would face this as well. Then shouts, footsteps. A voice called out, not from the afterlife, but from the living. "Antony." Cleopatra's voice. She was alive. His eyes widened, filled with pain and disbelief. He had been deceived. Chapter 11, The Queen's Choice. Cleopatra's servants carried Antony to her mausoleum. His strength fading fast, he gasped for breath, his hand gripping hers. When Cleopatra saw him, she let out a cry, rushing to his side. "I was told you were dead," he whispered. She pressed a hand to his cheek, tears falling freely. "I sent the lie to save you." He gave a weak, bitter smile, "Then let it be my last victory." Cleopatra kissed him, and in her arms, Antony took his final breath. The greatest general of Rome, the last defender of their love, was gone. Now she was alone. Outside the palace walls, Octavian's legions prepared to storm Alexandria. The queen who had once enthralled Caesar and Antony now faced the cold reality of Rome's triumph. She knew what Octavian wanted. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome, a conquered queen, a trophy of war. She would not give him that satisfaction. Chapter 12, Death of a Queen. Cleopatra sat in her chamber, dressed in royal finery. She adorned herself in gold and pearls, her eyes lined with kohl. Her lips painted the deep red of Egyptian royalty. If she was to meet her fate, she would do so as a queen. Octavian's men arrived, demanding her surrender. She welcomed them with calm grace, offering them wine and honeyed words. But as they watched her, they failed to notice the small basket delivered by a servant, a basket filled with figs, and beneath the fruit, something far deadlier. A venomous asp. Once alone, Cleopatra reached into the basket and lifted the serpent. She held it carefully, understanding its power. As she lay back on her golden couch, her mind drifted to Antony, to the first time she saw him in Tarsus, to the nights of laughter in Alexandria, to the battles they had fought together. She had lost the war, but Rome would never have her. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found Cleopatra lifeless, draped in silks, as regal in death as she had been in life. Epilogue, a legacy beyond death. News of Cleopatra's passing spread quickly. Octavian was denied his triumph. Instead of a captive queen, he had only a lifeless body. Antony and Cleopatra's children were taken to Rome, their fate left to history. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, ending the last dynasty of the pharaohs. But though their reign ended, their legend endured. Poets, playwrights, and historians would tell their story for centuries, a tale of love and war, of passion and betrayal, of a queen and a general who defied an empire. And in the annals of history, their names would be forever linked. Antony and Cleopatra, not just lovers, but legends,